Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce this morning Jenny Pickworth Glusker. And I'll tell you a little bit of background on Jenny, and this I got from her memoir, which is on the history page. I recommend to everyone that you look at the history page. And our Virginia Pat is responsible for this wonderful venture and is putting together many videos that have been in the archives for a while but haven't found a way to get to you. So please check it frequently and do make use of it. Jenny Pickworth grew up in Birmingham, UK. She was the daughter of two medical doctors. Her father had first studied chemistry, and her mother became a doctor during World War I when there was a shortage of medical students. Jenny became interested in chemistry through an inspiring high school teacher and also through a book that she found in her parents' things called Incompatible Medicines, which explains the chemistry of why the medicines were incompatible, which was kind of a fascinating concept. She was given a chemistry set, and she remembers creating wonderfully colored solutions and evil-smelling products. Her father and she always had a special relationship. They talked and argued together about ideas. They took long walks in nature, and he was very encouraging to her. Sort of by accident, Jenny found that Cambridge did not treat women very well, but Oxford had given degrees for quite a while, and so she determined to go to Oxford. Unfortunately, that was not the tradition in her school or what her parents thought would be a great idea. They wanted her to go to medical school. But she was able to make a pact with her father that if she could get into Oxford right away that year, then she could go there and not to medical school. And that's what happened. The entrance examiner for Jenny turned out to be Dorothy Hodgkin. And Jenny correctly identified the unknown that was given to her, which was something familiar to her from doing photography with her father. It was these beautiful crystals of hypo. So she got into Somerville College, which is the women's college associated with Oxford, and Dorothy became her tutor. She wanted to do spectroscopy first and was in the undergraduate lab with Harold Thompson, where she met her future husband, Don Glusker, who was a Rhodes Scholar in that laboratory. He was from Berkeley originally. But IR wasn't working out, and so she joined Dorothy's lab and learned about crystallography. She studied vitamin B12, as you may well know, which was at that time called anti-pernicious anemia factor. It still is, but that was the reason to go after the vitamin B12 structure. And she successfully determined that the Corin ring was different by one bond from the heme ring. Jenny spent a year postdoc with Robert Corey at Caltech. At the time, he was collaborating with Linus Pauling, and also Linus had just received the Nobel Prize. She worked on some peptide crystal structures there. Although expecting to work in industry, she and her husband thought that that was the best way to get a job in the same city. Dorothy insisted that she apply for the Institute of Cancer Research, and she had met Lindo Patterson a year or so earlier at the IUCR. So she was keen for that, not sure she could get in, but indeed she did get in. And as we say, the rest is history. She's been there for her entire career, very successfully. Lindo Patterson was her postdoc advisor and then her colleague. And she is known for her excellent research, but also for her love of teaching crystallography in particular. And she's written several wonderful monographs on this and articles which have been published. She's also known for mentoring scientists. In 1979, she was the president of the ACA and has been very active in IUCR, including on the Teaching Commission. We're very pleased to have Jenny here today. to talk to us on early crystallographic investigations of Nobel laureate Dorothy Hodgkin.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's just by chance that I got to know Dorothy Hodgkin. I had, as Martha said, the school that I went to sent all their science students to Cambridge. But at one point when I was in high school, our principal, who had a PhD from Cambridge, announced that she had finally got her diploma and was accepted as a member of the university. And I thought this was horrific. I thought that if you went to the university and you got your degree, you should get your degree whether you were a man or a woman. So that's why I went to Oxford and was interviewed by this quiet lady who has played quite an important influence in my life, but it's all just was by chance. So I'm going to talk to you about the Google Doodle lady. You never know what to expect in the morning when you get up and you go to Google, and there is this, which, as you probably mostly know, is a picture of the structure of penicillin, which Dorothy worked out. And if you clicked on the picture, you would get some information about her life. So they preceded me with introducing her to you, and I'm sure you all knew about her anyway. She used to come regularly to meetings, IUCR meetings, and was well known. So there is a picture of her. I would describe her as an elegant lady, very sweet, soft-spoken, very intelligent, and she was a wonderful person to work for. And she must have been lovely when she was young, with very blonde and very piercing blue eyes. So there she is. And so her early home life, I didn't know all the years I actually worked with her, but when she came to visit and the FBI turned up at Fox Chase, I found out she was born in Cairo, Egypt. And she did manage, as a lot of women did in that time, to hide her date of birth. So it took a long time for those of us who tried to do a biographical book on her to actually be sure that we got the right date. She was the daughter of a rather interesting man who was an Egyptologist and historian, and served most of his professional life in Egypt, the Sudan, and what is now Israel. And so she knew those areas quite well. And her mother was an expert in ancient textiles. So there you're seeing the beginning of how she could have become interested in crystals. And she lived abroad for the first 4 years of her life, and she was one of 4 girls. She was the eldest of 4 girls. And in those days, it was very common for the eldest daughter to be looking after her sisters. So she was quite a caring person, knew how to watch out to see what people needed. And she traveled to visit her parents, but they often left her in England for schooling. And she was educated locally in Suffolk, which was where the family came from. And she studied at Somerville College, Oxford. At that time, there were 5 women's colleges in Oxford and 23 men's colleges. And Somerville was viewed as a blue-stocking, important academic college. And we've had, I think, 5 international prime ministers learned there, like Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi. I think Golda Meir studied there too. We do celebrate how many people we have at Somerville, how many people we have helped with education. Now, all the coursework was co-educational. In my year in chemistry, there were 120 men and 5 women. And the 5 women, of course, became very close friends, and we've kept in contact ever since. So she studied for her undergraduate degree in chemistry, got a first-class degree, was one of the first women to obtain a top degree. I guess that's like someone from Laureate or something in this country, but it was very important. So of course the college wanted her to stay and teach there, But she decided, she had a friend, Dr. Joseph, who said, you might enjoy going to Cambridge. There's a man there, Desmond Burnell, who you would find interesting to work for. And so that's why she went to Cambridge and got her PhD there. And, but they had already given her a fellowship. The college was ready to wait for her to come back. And so when she had finished her PhD, she went back to Oxford and became eventually a university lecturer. She did have a hard time getting the titles that she deserved, but she did get them in the end, of course. And there is the college. It's a very nice college to go to. Now all the colleges in Oxford are co-educational, and but it was a very pleasant, at that time actually, if you were in a women's college, you had a lot of women friends in all different courses, and I mean, my best friend was a geographer and another one was a famous writer eventually. So you got to know a lot of women, and then you had the courses with the men, and you got to know them. So she went to work with Burnell, who was a very brilliant scientist, referred to as the sage, and had good ideas on all kinds of things. So she was very impressed. And as I say there, she admired him unreservedly. So she married Thomas Hodgkin, who was a tutor in one of the colleges. And he was an advisor to the president of Ghana later in life. He spent a lot of time in Africa. And even when I was working with Dorothy, I was often employed to draw maps of Africa with little bits of information on that he was writing articles about. And they had 3 children. Luke was very interested in mathematics and a topologist at King's College London. As it says there, he also taught in other places. Liz took on more social problems and worked in Vietnam a lot, and is presently in the Sudan, where we kind of worry about her. I mean, she's older now, and it's quite a dangerous place for her to be, and she's trying to do as much help to the population there as can be done. And Toby, I heard talk a few years ago when they had a party in London for Dorothy's 100th birthday. I mean, she died a while ago, when she was 84, but they had a 100th birthday party for her. And he gave a fantastic talk on seed conservation and building up stores of seeds of the original plants, not the mutated plants that we use nowadays, because the original plants are more fertile. And so he was going around the world looking for the right plants. And then I have this picture, which I was told Dorothy drew, and it's for her father for a book he was writing, and it's from a mosaic in Jerash, which I think is somewhere in or around Israel. But you can see, I don't know how good that slide is. It was very difficult to get this picture, and I think it resides in a storage place in one of the universities. But I did get this copy. But you can see the symmetry, how beautifully it was drawn. She was a very good artist, and she could draw beautifully, and she had very tiny handwriting, but she produced these wonderful pictures. So I had planned to just talk about Dorothy, but when I saw it as out in the newsletter, it said about women in crystallography. So I thought I'd just mention some of the people who were her colleagues, particularly in Burnell's lab. And one of the most famous was Kathleen Lonsdale, who sort of kept all the crystallographies in order, made sure they did the thing properly. She was, well, I worked for Lindo Patterson, and Jean Minkin was a colleague of mine in the lab. And if we got a letter from Kathleen Lonsdale on Thursday or Friday, we would hide it till the following Monday, because it had a lot of instructions on things he had to do to improve international tables. I mean, perfectly good things, but we knew he would worry the whole weekend about it and what he was going to do about it, and he seemed to react better when he heard about it on Monday morning. But she was a Quaker and spent her 40th birthday in jail for refusing to do fire watching during the war, but she also wrote a very good textbook on crystallography and worked on ferroelectricity and listed all the space groups, 230 space groups in her handwriting, all the equations derived from them. So she did it in her handwriting and had them photocopy, which was unusual in those days, to make sure that it was done correctly. But she's most famous for the structure of hexamethyl benzene, in which she was able to show that the benzene ring is planar and that the benzene ring is not composed of alternate single and double bonds, that all the carbon-carbon bonds are equal in length. And in 1928 she published the structure, and believe me, in those days it took many years to produce a crystal structure. However, she was working for the older Bragg, William Henry Bragg, who had, for a long time, had a lab in Australia, and then he moved to England. But he tended to have about half of the people working in his lab were women, and so I feel that he's probably responsible for helping women see that they can work well in this particular field of science. And he knew that she had 3 small children, so he knew she needed help, and he actually provided her with funds to get a babysitter to look after them so she could come to work, because he thought it was a waste that she should stay home and not be able to do any science at that time. And so Dorothy Hodgkin wrote about her. There is a sense in which she appeared to own the whole of crystallography in her time. And that's said with warmth and love, not with any other meaning, just she really admired Kathleen Lonsdale. Another person who was always fun to see at the meeting, and for another reason that I'll discuss later, was Helen McGaw, who was interested in ice structure and ferroelectrics, and was the kind of person who would go to a meeting and be very helpful to any of the women there, encourage them to join in with the discussions and so on. And there is a book on the life of Dorothy Hodgkin by Georgina Ferry. Maybe some of you have heard her talk. And there is a picture of Dorothy at a very young age. We did a biography book on Dorothy. I did it with David Sayre and Guy Dodson. And we had a chapter in it which was called 40 Years with Dorothy by Max Perutz. But Oxford University Press was not able to get the book finally produced for her 70th birthday. So they sent us the proofs, all, spirally bound. And Dorothy said, I have to see what he wrote. So, of course, almost every sentence she said, this has to be changed, this has to be changed. And they had a photograph of her. And I had always thought Dorothy was not particularly interested in how she looked, she was dressed nicely, but never in fashion or anything. But she looked at the photograph, she said, that wasn't 40 years ago, that was, say, like 10 years ago. She said, I have to have another photograph. So she produced this photograph. I think she was 19 years old at the time, which was also not 40 years ago. More like 50 or 60, but there we are. So anyway, that was Dorothy. And I saw an archivist at that time from the American Philosophical Society. He was in to collect the works of Linus Pauling. And he said, be sure to keep both versions of that chapter. Because Dorothy kept rewriting it, He shouldn't have said that, he should have said this, and this is not how I remember it. So the other chapters, she just thought were nice and looked at them, but the one by Max Perutz, she re-edited, and the picture there was changed. So that's what happens. So I'm here to talk about a person who actually worked on 4, maybe I should say 5 of the most important chemicals of the time, at a time when it was very difficult to do so. And so not only did they advance the understanding of biochemistry, but they advanced our understanding of how to do crystal structures. Cholesterol in 1945 during the war, penicillin also during the war, B12 when I was a graduate student, and insulin from about 1935 on and off. And Maureen Mackay in her lab, who I'm sorry, she's an Australian lady who died recently, but she worked on the structure of morphine. So there you have cholesterol, penicillin, vitamin B12 and insulin and morphine. You're dealing with some of the most important chemicals that you can think of. Okay. So she worked in the University Museum, very strange place to work. We worked, it was designed by Ruskin, and it has the ceiling, the roof of that museum has a lot of windows and large glass panels in it, and lots of skeletons and lots of minerals. But we worked in a room where there was something in 1860 called the famous evolution debate between Bishop Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley, in which there was a question, as about the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which had just come out, and the bishop was the monkeys by his father or his mother. And he said he was proud to have that kind of an ancestor, and he was sorry that he was being questioned by someone who didn't use his best intelligence to think about this more carefully. There was a big debate about it anyway. It's called a debate, actually it was an argument at a meeting of the British Association, but it's quite famous. Anyway, here we are in this room. It was rather nice though. I mean, next room I could attend a lecture on the Kon-Tiki or various other things we could do. You went down to the basement where the X-ray equipment was, and they had a long pipe the water pipe that led to where the developing tanks were and so on. And on a cold morning when you got to work, everyone sort of did things on their desks, and then we all went down and we all sat on this hot water pipe and had a nice discussion, in the dark, and had a nice discussion. So here is crystallography, 1949, before my time, but because I had just started. But let's see. Yeah, here is Cecily Darwin, great-granddaughter of Charles Darwin, who worked for Dorothy. Here is David Sayre, who I'm sure you all know very well. Who else would be of interest? Here is Tiny Powell, who was tiny, and we all called him Tiny, but we didn't know. We thought he didn't know we were calling him Tiny, but of course he knew we were calling him Tiny. And who else is there? Well, there is Dorothy. And then we go a bit further, and there is John Robertson, who worked on B12. This is Frank Welch, who kept all the equipment working. Beryl Oughton, who worked on insulin. Maureen Mackay, who worked on morphine. Tiny, and his student, and these are some other students. And there's Dorothy, and Monica Webster worked for Dorothy. So that's kind of what the lab is. I show those pictures just to show that in general the members of the lab were about half and half women and men. I didn't do an actual count, to tell you the truth, but there were plenty of men. In fact, her first student was a man, and everyone said, how can you be doing science working for a woman? But he had a good time. I mean, a good scientist. So Dorothy did her, in Oxford, if you did a degree in chemistry, you had to do a year's research and report on it. You could get your chemistry degree after 3 years and go into industry or so. But if you wanted to be academic, you had to do a year's research. So she worked with Tiny Powell on the thallium dialkyl halides. I don't think that part of her life went so well. I think she kind of felt that was not what she really wanted to know about. But Bernal had been working on steroids and was interested in what the chemical formula of the steroids were. And so he showed that if you grew crystals of the various steroids, they're roughly planar molecules, So you can tell from their interaction with light in which direction in the unit cell or in the crystal the molecules lay, and he said the current formulae would work. So let me see, pressing the wrong button. And so here is the structure that was known at the time by Wieland and Windhouse. And you know, there's a couple of extra atoms. This one and this one here, they weren't quite sure what it was. And he said that if you make a model of this molecule, it won't fit into the unit cell. And he said it has to look more like this. And then here is the actual kind of structure that you do see. So Dorothy worked on, with Pankuchen, and I think some of you saw a picture of them both the other day. She studied over 100 steroids and did unit cells and space groups and so on. But then when she went to Oxford, she worked with Harry Carlisle on the structure of cholesterol iodide. And that was done during the war, so I understand that he did all these calculations on the train traveling between Oxford and London, because most scientists during World War II were very involved with helping the government. So, but they also worked on the structure of cholesterol iodide. And she actually had cholesterol bromide, chloride, and iodide, and worked on them. And it was, they already knew about the Patterson function. So with cholesterol iodide, for example, and the bromide, she was able to find the location of the heavy atoms and work from there. The chloride, I gather, may give her a bit more trouble. And so she wasn't sure. I think it was many years later that people proved that the chloride and the the chloride and the bromide could be isomorphous. So that was one of the important things she did. So having worked with Bernal and his interest in steroids, she then showed exactly what the chemical formula was. So that was exciting. But then she also worked on penicillin, which was found by Alexander Fleming in St Mary Hospital in 1929. Although once they found it and found how good it could be, which they found later, a lot of doctors wrote to journals like The Lancet and the British Medical Journal to say, well, I've been growing mouldy bread in the basement for years, and I get the local pharmacist to put them into pills, and they have wonderful effects, So a lot of the medical professionals said they already knew that you could produce antibiotics, but of course had to make sure that their patients didn't find out the source of the pills that they were getting. So he named this penicillin, and he was worried about it. But of course, there was an urgent need for something that was antibiotic, because there were so many people getting wounded in the trenches in World War I, and the trenches were just earth, dug out of earth, and ideal for infection. And a huge number of men died from the infections of their wounds rather than directly from their wounds. So penicillin, this is World War II, we're very excited about it. So penicillin kills the bacterial cells when they divide, and it works by binding to the enzyme transpeptidase. And in this country, I know my husband was the first person in his town to be given penicillin for a mastoid ear infection. And they brought big tanks of penicillin to inject into him. They didn't know how much to give. He said after the first tank load his pain was gone and he was fine, but they had to do it for a length of time. But later on they learned how to do it. So she worked with penicillin with Charles Bunn and Barbara Lowe, who is in this country now, and they looked again, as Dorothy often did, don't just take one compound, take some related compounds. So she looked at the sodium, potassium, and rubidium salts. And she got the structure, which I show here, the one on the far left with the four-membered ring, which was a surprise to the English. Now, I've given this lecture, I've talked about this in other lectures, not this particular lecture, but in other lectures, and I've had a lot of correspondence from people saying people in America knew anyway that it was a four-membered ring. The chemists, they already knew it, you see. But the communication during World War II between England and the United States was very difficult, and we just couldn't get hold of anything that hadn't passed through the censors with their scissors. I mean, they didn't blue pencil, they cut anything they were worried about out. So we didn't know that. And as I say here, Sir Robert Robinson, the professor, didn't like the four-membered ring because he said it would be unstable. And Cornforth said if penicillin turns out to have the beta-lactam structure, which it did, I shall give up chemistry and grammar. Actually, 11 years later, he got a Nobel Prize for his work, which had nothing to do with penicillin. So there were a lot of people who said this can't be right. This happened for quite a few structures at that time. David Sayre had worked on the structure of, what was it? A chrysene derivative, or hexamethylene benzene, yes. No. Well, it was a polycyclic hydrocarbon, and he showed it couldn't be planar because it had a methyl group, and it caused cancer. And a lot of articles said it's a shame he got the wrong structure, which of course he didn't. So people were not tremendously believing some of the work that came out of crystal structure work, which was a shame because in general they were right. So, but I also, on the right of this, I show that the beta-lactam and the oxazolone structures, a lot of the molecule would be very similar. But so Dorothy worked on all three of those structures, the sodium, potassium, and rubidium, and showed that she got the same structure. And something that she did that was very useful, by then you could calculate electron density maps, and you'd use Fourier series, and we would plot them onto sheets of plastic, as you see here. And you could see the three-dimensionality. Here's the four-membered ring. You could see the three-dimensionality. And that was very useful for people who are not crystallographers, who finally said, oh, I see what you're talking about when you talk about three-dimensionals. So this particular picture is quite famous for that, for being an explanation of what you're doing with 3 dimensions. And the other thing I want to point out is it's very hard to do 3-dimensional structures when you have to measure each intensity by eye. You have to do all your Fourier calculations, working out sine squared theta over lambda. There are people who did that all day long, and we don't even think about that now. It's easier to go to 2 dimensions, and a lot of people worked in 2 dimensions. And when I went to work with Lindo Patterson, he said, we always work in 2 dimensions. And I said, well, I come from a place where they work in 3 dimensions, and he didn't think that was such a good idea. It takes up so much time, but eventually that's what we did. But Dorothy was the one who said, if you really want to know things about complicated structures, you really have to collect all the data, and you have to analyze all of the data. And Kathleen Lonsdale would chirp in and say, and you've got to do it very carefully and double check it and make sure you did it properly. So between those 2 ladies, the whole thing was being run well. So this, I mean, she got the structure of penicillin, and it's the correct structure. And here it is from the protein data bank in penicillin acylase. And that is what you saw on the other day, if you went to, I think it was, 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you go to Google. I don't know how this Google picture came about. I haven't found anyone who knows it. If any of you know how this came about, please tell the audience at the end of the talk. Okay, then we come to vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is a cure for pernicious anemia. And I saw in the New York Times a short while ago, in the magazine section on Sunday, they often have a patient who turns up with a disease, and they try to find out what the disease was. And in this case, it was pernicious anemia, and the doctors who were looking at it didn't know what was going on. but quite a few people had it, and you have this particular anemia, and they found that, Nino and Whipple found that if you give people a lot of raw, you had to eat a lot of raw liver, and that would help you. But the question was, why do you have to eat so much liver when the average person can have liver once a month and survive, or never and survive? So the answer is that you have an enzyme in your digestive system that takes the B12, any B12 you got from the liver, you'll take it into the body. And so you have to have both the vitamin B12 and a means of getting it inside you. So that was solved by giving you injections of vitamin B12, which is why you have to have injections. You can eat a lot of liver, but it doesn't work very well, but it's much better. And when I went to Philadelphia, they said almost every doctor, if you went to the doctor and said, I don't feel very well, he said, okay, I'll give you a B12 injection. So they decided they would try and find out what was the important part, what was the important material in vitamin B12, in liver. And so that was being studied by Glaxo and Squibb and various other places. It's a vitamin that is only made by bacteria, and I've been to meetings where I've seen the way bacteria make vitamin B12. It's just multiple reactions. So the human body is not able to do it, it has to take it in. But it contains cobalt. And crystals were brought to Kathleen Lonsdale, actually, and she gave them to Dorothy because she knew Dorothy was more interested in biochemical studies, I suppose. Anyway, I saw the remark that Dorothy worked with them, with Kathleen Lonsdale looking over her shoulder. So they wanted to know if the they wanted to know if the vitamin B12 which had been isolated in America was the same as that was isolated by Glaxo in England. So they brought the crystals to some other scientists in Oxford, and Dorothy heard about it, so she determined the cell dimensions. And they said, well, you've got cobalt in this molecule, it's about 100 atoms, non-hydrogen atoms. So you can maybe do that as a heavy atom structure. And then there were all the crystallographers who were solving F-squared values to see whether cobalt could give you the information, and were saying, no, cobalt isn't heavy enough, you need a heavier atom than cobalt. Dorothy didn't care. She said, we'll just go ahead and see what we can do with the Patterson. And so she looked at the Patterson of vitamin B12, and you could see where the cobalt was. It was orthorhombic P2121, and there she could find the cobalt. So she said she knew deep down inside herself that she could solve the structure of vitamin B12. And I think Kathleen Lonsdale said, go ahead, it's your problem. She was working more with the physical aspects of crystals. But it shows, they were good friends and willing to help each other. There actually are two B12 dependent enzymes, and one uses methyl B12, which Miriam Rossi worked on, and the other one was adenosyl B12, which Galen Lenhart did the crystal structure of. And it was found to be the first organometallic naturally occurring compound. It has a CO-C bond in it. So it's getting to be interesting already. And I just want to remind you of computing at the time, that the computers filled many rooms, and they took a couple of hours every morning when you couldn't use them because they were checking how many of the tubes had failed during the night. You could listen to the sounds they made, so Dick Marsh could sing for you what a Fourier calculation sounded like. And so the crystallographers would sleep by the computer, and they'd wake up, when a strange sound came, which meant something had happened in that room. So you were doing Fourier summations, and I was by then a graduate student doing looking at Patterson projections and electron density maps, and you did it with punch cards, And Dorothy had a Hollerith machine, which was designed for one of the very early census calculations at the beginning of the 20th century. And it could only add, so you had to fool the computer. If you wanted to subtract, you did a whole lot of leading lines. And, if you do it often enough, you can think of any number as both its positive number and what negative number would be. And we used punch cards, which had holes in them, and it depended on how long it took for the card to be read, so then the computer knew what the number was that you were dealing with. And the first thing, before I continue, I want to remind you, if you're talking about women in science, about Ada, Countess of Lovelace, who was the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet, an English lady, and she wrote a description of Charles Babbage's early computer, and she died in 1852, but she was a mathematician, and she knew all about algorithms. So here is the first computer programmer, is a lady. Just wanted to see that we were talking about women in science. So Lord Todd was the chemist professor at Cambridge, and he was working on B12 too to try and find out what the chemical formula was. But they were getting very simple derivatives like succinic acid, and nothing that was very helpful. They had an Australian postdoc visiting named Jack Hanna, and he was so frustrated that he couldn't get good crystals of a degradation product he made, that he went through the lab and poured just about every organic chemical he could find into his solution, went skiing in Europe for for a month I think it was, came back and found this crystal, which was of hexacarboxylic acid. And nobody has been able to grow this particular crystal again. But there it was, a really beautiful crystal. And I had just gone to the lab and was going to do graduate work there. So Dorothy said, here's a crystal. Collect the data. So I collected the data, eye estimation of Weissenberg photographs, trying to think about the size of the spots as well as the spots themselves. Could walk down the street and see lines, the circle, loops of dots as I walked across the street, and so on. But actually eye estimation wasn't too bad because you put in several layers of film, and then each layer of film cut the intensity just a little bit, and so you had many measurements. So I then decided I would calculate the Patterson projection. And I thought to start with I would just do it in projection, so you'd only have to use the HK naught and the naught, what was this one? I guess naught, H naught L projection, and see if I could find the cobalt atom. And to everyone's surprise, I did. Here we are. There's a cobalt, those are the cobalt peaks. So we have the positions. And John H. Robertson, who was who eventually ended up at Leeds University, was not the Scottish John Robertson, he was the English John Robertson crystallographer, and he saw this and he said, no, you've got to work in 3 dimensions. So he calculated the map, but that took 3 or 4 months to do, huge piles of cards and so on. So we proceeded without looking at the 3-dimensional Patterson map, because we had already found these coordinates for the cobalt atom. But in order to do a 3-dimensional electron density map, you needed huge piles of IBM cards. So we painted the tops of the cards depending on what kind of a function it was, a cosine of an even function, cosine of an odd. We divided the unit cell into 60 by 60 by 60 parts, the 60 to do with how many degrees there are in a circle. And I was sent to the room where they had this Hollerith machine, which was in the agricultural economics department, down in the basement. And I remember asking if I could have some drapes, because people were always pouring in at night. So I was working there till 2 in the morning. And then, of course, I had a policeman who wanted to know what a lady was doing walking home alone at 2 in the morning. So I had a nightly police escort home to make sure I was going to a real home and not just a runaway. So it took about 6 weeks to do this electron density map, taking the positions that we found from the Patterson positions and just looking at the cobalt atom, which, as I remember, was probably what Dorothy had used for both penicillin and cholesterol iodide. And here we have the map phased on just this cobalt atom, and here is the structure, which, as Martha just told you, consists of 4 pyrrole rings, has a spectrum somewhat like a porphyrin, but not quite like a porphyrin, because 2 of the rings are directly joined, those 2 rings. So here is the structure of the that we found, picking the peaks just around the cobalt and making, if you like, a larger heavy atom. And then we put in the heavy atom and all these atoms, except for this one, which didn't look very good. So I thought, there might be something funny here, so we left this one out. But it came in on the second map, which was just this small expanded heavy atom, not using any of the other atoms or out in the general structure. And we got the structure. It had a chloride, which we didn't realize, and a cyanide. Chloride, cyanide, and these rings. And then Dorothy was able to go back. She got the formula now because she had a lot of trouble with analyzing the vitamin B12 structure. This was a hexacarboxylic acid that had a lot of this stuff removed, which they knew the structure of, a ribose and so on. And now she had a good model, and so they were able to proceed with analyzing the actual vitamin structure. And they also had a selenocyanide, where they had selenium here. So eventually the structure of vitamin B12 was solved, and Gale and Leonard had gone to Oxford and worked on the adenosyl. Here's the adenosyl group for the one kind of vitamin B12. Here we are. And of course, if you've done something really exciting, there are always people who want to claim the credit. So Lord Todd at Cambridge decided he'd done a really good job and given Dorothy made sure Dorothy got the right crystals and so on. And after all, crystallographers are just technicians who tell you what the structure is. So one day Dorothy had a message from a friend of hers saying Lord Todd was giving a lecture in the south of England and he was talking about some new nitrogen-containing compounds. So she came to me and she said, I don't remember that he was working on nitrogen-containing compounds, except he comes every once in a while to Oxford to see how we're doing with getting the formula of vitamin B12. So she said, I'm going down to listen to his lecture. So she rushed out of the lab, went down to the south of England, which is it's easier than traveling in the US. And she went to the lecture, and at the end of it, she said, you might like to know what the structure is. So I learned from her what to do when things seem bad. She said, oh no, you know, he's okay. He's just excited about it. But there were people from his lab were giving all sorts of reports. And you know, to some extent we felt Jack Cannon deserved a lot of credit because he got those crystals that gave the hexa acid and vitamin B12. So everyone in her lab, she got the whole lab mobilized, and every time there was a talk from Todd's lab in Europe or in England, somebody had to go to the lecture and stand up at the end and say this was done by X-ray crystallography. The organic chemists only had succinic acid and a few very simple little 4 carbon structures. And here we have 100 carbons, or 100 atoms anyway. And so finally, Todd did write a retraction. But Dorothy had been going around Europe and everyone had been saying to her, do you believe Todd's structure? You know, you're a crystallographer, do you believe Todd's got his structure right? And she would say, well, he didn't really have too much to do with the actual structure. So you have to be careful, but there we are. So, but they remained friends, you know. And he wrote a retraction, but he wrote it in the New York Times, which was not what the average English person was reading, or even could get hold of. So that's the story of vitamin B12, and now Kathleen Drennan has been working looking at the enzymes, which is very exciting work, and exactly what B12 does. And two types of vitamin B12s that I told you, and 2 types of enzymes that they work on. So I have to get moving a bit. And so we come to proteins, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it was in the around 1934 that Bernal obtained the first X-ray diffraction photograph. And the reason he did that was because Dorothy was the woman in the lab who would have normally done it, but she had come down with very bad arthritis, and she had a very important meeting in London to have people see what they could do for her, which turned out to be pretty much nothing, but there we are. And he found that they got crystals of pepsin, and they were trying to see if they would diffract. And he didn't get any diffraction pattern, but then thought about making sure it was surrounded, dehydrated by water in the tube. As you all know, that's a standard way of looking at proteins. And Dorothy helped with the subsequent experiments, and they got some information, some diffraction, but of course a very big unit cells and lots of diffraction spots. So, but in 1934, Dorothy decided that she was very interested in insulin, and so Robert Robinson, the chemistry professor, had given her crystals, and she obtained diffraction patterns. So all through the time that I was in Oxford, people were looking at Patterson maps of insulin, and as it's rhombohedral, the maps, of course, are beautiful, 6-fold symmetry, just look lovely. And people were working on them, and they saw that there were obviously some 10 angstrom distances, but couldn't solve it too much. But then later on, Guy Dodson was there, and various other important people who worked with her on insulin. This is a picture that shows on the far left Bernal and John Kendrew and Dorothy with a nice smile, and David Phillips, who was an advisor to the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was a student of Dorothy's. So, and there's Guy Dodson, who we all now miss very much. But he did wonderful work. Tom Blundell, quite a huge number of people worked on that. But you can see how much she enjoyed this. Look at, every time I show a picture of her, there's a big, broad smile on her face. And here is a drawing she made of the Patterson Map, a bit of the Patterson Map of insulin, and she gave it to Helen McGaw as a present. It's sort of rather nice and almost reminiscent of the mosaic drawing she did earlier on. So even though her hands were completely gnarled with arthritis, she still could do nice drawings. And down at the bottom, you will see the very tiny handwriting that she had. It says insulin contour map of interatomic distances, which was how they talked about it. Patterson always called it the F-squared map. It's only after he died, really, that we all know it now as the Patterson map. And then in 1951, they had the British had an international exhibition to sort of think about art after World War II. And I remember going, the Vienna State Opera had not gone back to Austria yet, so one was able to go to wonderful operas. And Helen McGaw was in charge of making designs for materials, where she used Patterson maps and all kinds of electron density maps. And I have a set of ties that were made. And here is a little bit of the insulin Patterson. See? So people knew a lot. It was very good for making sure people knew that crystallography was an important science. And so I want to just talk a little bit at the end about her private life. She had 3 children. She was described by various scientists as there were always children crawling all over her all the time. But they obviously adored her, and she was very happy and I told you earlier what they did. She became a member of the Royal Society, which was something she wanted very much. And she had a first great-grandchild born in this country, and she was so excited that she wrote me long letters about how excited she was to be a great-grandmother. That's Sam. And I list her honours. I don't know if you really need to know them all. She was a Fellow of the Royal Society, Nobel Prize, single award. She had been interviewed actually by some Swedish newspapers a couple of years before. And her husband Thomas was a very good husband, but he was a very good cook as well. But he was liable to say to her, Dorothy, while you're talking to these people, I put some potatoes in a pot and it's boiling. In 20 minutes, please turn the thing on. So she was interviewing these Swedes, and they were talking about, she must have been on the list, but she wasn't chosen that year. So she's reported in the Swedish newspapers as saying, "Mein Gott, die Kartoffeln," which is "My God, the potatoes." She had forgotten. Of course, I smelled them when they were burning. But there we are. So she was not reliable in that way. She got the Order of Merit. Kathleen Lonsdale had become a Dane, which is the female equivalent of Sir. And Dorothy did not want that title. She was more leftish in her politics. And so she was thrilled when she got the Order of Merit when Winston Churchill died, and there was an opening there. She was a Chancellor at Bristol University, President of IUCR, Copley Medal from the Royal Society, and President of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, just to list a few. I mean, I'm sure you don't want a full list. And there she is, going to get the Nobel Prize, and look how pleased she is. And the nice thing about that photograph is that Thomas has sort of tidied himself up, and he looks really, really elegant. When she got the Order of Merit, he drove his oldest car to Buckingham Palace. And, the guards at the gate said, "What are you here?" And he says, "I'm here because I'm meeting my wife and she's getting something or other from the Queen." They said, "We'll go around the side and park on the street over there." So he wasn't thrilled with that, but I love that picture. And when she got the Nobel Prize, I don't know if you know, there's a person who reviews movies and so on, Rex Reed, wrote a little article to say how thrilled he was to see a woman who obviously had great intelligence receiving an award, and how impressed he was with Dorothy, so I really like that. And she appeared on, as you saw the other day, she appeared on several postage stamps, but here she is with her picture. And Margaret Thatcher was one of her students. Now Dorothy was very careful. She was very political, very interested in somewhat leftish organizations. She was not a member of the Communist Party, and she wanted to go to a meeting in Pasadena where Pauling was talking. She was friends with Pauling, and she wanted to go and hear his views on protein structure. And the US government said she could not have a visa because her husband had been a member of the Communist Party. And she said to me, people who thought about life in the early 30s, a lot of them were communists for a short period of time, not necessarily for long, but they had thought about things, So she was sad about that. But her husband had also applied to come with her, but mentioned that he was, I think, still a member of the Communist Party. So he was interviewed by a different panel. So he got his visa, and she could not get a visa, even though scientists from all over England, and I guess even Linus, were trying to get her to she was not able to go to that meeting. But Margaret Thatcher did work with Dorothy Hodgkin. She did her part 2. I think she worked on Grammicide in S. And David Phillips would tell me that Margaret Thatcher, who was the only scientific Prime Minister the English had had at that time, really worked was a very hard worker and really worked very hard, but of course a lot of people didn't like what she did, a lot of people liked it, but a lot of people didn't like it. But he told me that if anything came up, if Dorothy said anything to Margaret Thatcher, she really listened and she would do what she was supposed to do. But she did enjoy meeting people. And she actually did a lot for women in getting money to do research. There were rules in England at that time that if you lived at home, you couldn't get student money. But if you lived in college or connected with college and you had to go away, then they would give you money to pay for your the place you lived and food and so on. But what happened a lot was the women would go to a place like Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, all the various universities, and then they would meet someone and they would get married. And immediately the government would say, okay, now you're married, you're living at home, so you don't get any more money. So she would, and then, a couple would come to her and say, we thought we could manage, but now we just don't have enough money. The grants were not very big here. And so she would write, and they said they would do it just for that one person. They would give them the money. And then she'd have to do it again and again and again. There was no way she could persuade them to do it for all people with that in mind. So, to come to the end of my talk, looking to think about Dorothy, I just looked. Jack Dunitz was one of her students and a great admirer of hers, and I just want to point out what he remarked about her. Her work was done not in isolation, but owed much to a lot of her contemporaries. And I don't know why she doesn't have Lonsdale on that list either. I don't have it, but there we are. She sensed the most significant structural problems in the field, and I think she got that from Bernal, or maybe she had it anyway. And she attacked these problems when they seemed well nigh insoluble, because people were always giving her advice that the way she was moving, doing cobalt in B12 wasn't going to work, but it led to all the discussions about how heavy an atom you would need in protein, so that was important. She had the perseverance to struggle on where others would have given up, and she had the skill and imagination to solve these problems once the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape. And I should also point out, of course, that Somerville had a very good principal who made sure that she had a position all the time that she was working there, so enough to maintain her family. So thank you very much for listening to that.